In the rolling wheat fields of Nebraska, where endless golden plains stretch toward horizons that promise new beginnings and second chances, a single decision made in desperation would unravel a web of secrets that had been carefully constructed. Across 2,000 miles and 3 years of carefully crafted lies. When Margaret Sullivan stepped off the westbound train in Cedar Falls with a baby in her arms and a heart full of secrets, she had no way of knowing that her new husband, Thomas Mitchell, carried his own hidden past that would collide with hers, in ways that would test the very foundations of truth, love, and the meaning of family itself. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning of September 14th, 1895, dawned crisp and clear across the Nebraska prairie, with the kind of crystalline air that made distant farmhouses appear close enough to touch, despite being miles away. Thomas Mitchell stood on the wooden platform of Cedar Falls Station, adjusting his best Sunday collar for the third time in 10 minutes, while watching the eastern horizon for the first sign of smoke that would announce the arrival of the 917. Westbound from Chicago. At 32, Thomas had built a life of quiet routine and careful planning in the 5 years since inheriting his father's wheat farm. The 640 acres of prime Nebraska soil had provided him with financial security and social standing in the small community of Cedar Falls, but they had also given him something he hadn't expected, a profound loneliness that seemed to grow stronger. With each successful harvest, the decision to seek a mail-order bride had not come easily to a man who prided himself on self-reliance and traditional values. For 2 years, Thomas had wrestled with the idea while watching his neighbors' children grow and prosper, while attending church socials where the conversation inevitably turned to family news he could not share, and while eating dinner alone. At a table built for 6, the correspondence with Margaret Sullivan had begun 6 months earlier through the Matrimonial News, a Chicago publication that specialized in connecting respectable women seeking new opportunities with established men. In the Western Territories, her letters had arrived with the regularity of clockwork, written in an elegant script that spoke of education and refinement, filled with details about her life as a seamstress in Chicago and her desire to build a family in the wholesome environment of rural Nebraska. What had drawn Thomas to Margaret's letters was not just her obvious intelligence and domestic skills, but something deeper that he recognized in her carefully chosen words. Between the lines of her descriptions of city life and her questions about farm routines, he sensed a quality of resilience and determination that reminded him of his own mother, who had helped his father transform raw prairie into productive farmland through sheer force of will and unwavering optimism. Margaret had written about her family background with the kind of vague references that suggested painful losses she preferred not to discuss in detail. Her parents had died in a factory fire when she was 17, she had explained, leaving her to support herself through seamstress work while living in a Chicago boarding house that catered to young working women. She had no siblings, no extended family, and no romantic attachments that would complicate her desire to start fresh in Nebraska. The photograph she had sent showed a woman of perhaps 26 with dark hair arranged in the practical style favored by working women, serious eyes that seemed to look directly into the camera with unswerving honesty, and the kind of composed expression that suggested someone accustomed to facing life's challenges without complaint. She was not conventionally beautiful in the manner of the fashion illustrations that appeared in ladies' magazines, but there was something in her face that spoke of strength and reliability. Thomas had responded to her letters with his own careful descriptions of life in Cedar Falls, detailing the rhythms of farm work, the close-knit nature of the community, and his hopes for building a family that would honor the memory of his parents while creating something new and lasting. He had been honest about his expectations for marriage, his financial circumstances, and his desire for children who would eventually inherit the land that had been in the Mitchell family for 2 generations. The correspondence had continued through the spring and summer of 1895, with each exchange revealing additional layers of compatibility and shared values. Margaret's questions about farm life demonstrated genuine interest rather than mere politeness, while her descriptions of her domestic skills suggested practical capabilities that would translate well to rural living. By July, Thomas had made the decision to propose marriage through correspondence, offering to send railroad fare and promising a wedding ceremony within a week of her arrival in Cedar Falls. Margaret's acceptance had arrived by return mail, expressing gratitude for his proposal and genuine excitement about beginning their life together in Nebraska. What Thomas did not know, and what Margaret's letters had carefully avoided mentioning, was that the seamstress from Chicago carried secrets that would have fundamentally altered his decision to pursue their correspondence. The woman stepping off the 917 westbound was not the simple working girl she had presented herself to be, and the baby she carried in her arms represented a complication that would test every assumption he had made about their future together. Margaret Sullivan had indeed worked as a seamstress in Chicago, but not in the respectable shop environment she had described in her letters. For 3 years, she had been employed in one of the city's most exclusive private establishments, creating custom garments for the wives and daughters of Chicago's wealthiest families. Her clients had included the wives of railroad barons, steel magnates, and political figures whose names appeared regularly in the society pages of Chicago newspapers. The position had provided her with financial security far beyond what most working women could expect, along with exposure to a world of luxury and sophistication that had shaped her understanding of quality and refinement. But it had also placed her in proximity to men whose wealth and power made them accustomed to taking whatever they desired, regardless of the consequences for those around them. The baby she carried had been born 3 months earlier in a private facility outside Chicago, the result of an encounter with one of her employer's clients that had begun as what she believed to be genuine courtship, and had ended in circumstances that left her with no legal recourse and no realistic options for compelling acknowledgement or support. Jonathan Whitmore III was the heir to one of Chicago's largest banking fortunes, a man whose family name appeared on buildings throughout the city and whose social connections included governors, senators, and industrialists who shaped national policy. When Margaret had discovered her pregnancy, Jonathan's response had been swift and decisive, complete denial of any relationship beyond that of client and seamstress, coupled with threats of legal action if she attempted to connect his name to her condition. The Whitmore family's influence extended throughout Chicago's legal and social systems, making any attempt to seek justice or support a futile gesture that would likely result in Margaret's complete ostracism from respectable society. Worse, Jonathan's father had made it clear through intermediaries that continued residence in Chicago would be inadvisable for both Margaret and her child. Facing the choice between destitution in an unfamiliar city or the possibility of building a new life in Nebraska, Margaret had made the decision to conceal her pregnancy while corresponding with Thomas Mitchell. Her plan had been to reveal the existence of her child gradually, presenting the baby as the orphaned infant of a deceased friend whom she had agreed to raise as her own. The deception had required careful timing and extensive preparation. Margaret had spent the final months of her pregnancy in a private boarding house outside Chicago, using her savings to pay for discretion and medical care while maintaining her correspondence with Thomas. She had crafted a story about caring for a sick friend whose death had left behind an infant in need of adoption, preparing Thomas for the possibility that she might arrive in Nebraska with additional responsibilities. As the train approached Cedar Falls station, Margaret checked her reflection in the window glass one final time, adjusting the modest traveling dress she had chosen to project an image of respectable widowhood while concealing the evidence of recent childbirth. The baby, whom she had named Elizabeth after her own mother, slept peacefully in her arms, unaware that her future depended entirely on the success of her mother's carefully constructed deception. The correspondence with Thomas had revealed him to be exactly the kind of man Margaret had hoped to find: honest, hard-working, financially stable, and eager to build a family that would give her daughter the security and respectability that had been denied to them in Chicago. But it had also made clear that he expected complete honesty from his future wife, a quality that made Margaret's deception both necessary and increasingly difficult to maintain. As the train's whistle announced their arrival in Cedar Falls, Margaret steeled herself for the performance that would determine whether she and Elizabeth would find the new beginning they desperately needed, or whether her carefully constructed plan would crumble under the weight of scrutiny from a man whose integrity demanded the same level of honesty she was incapable of providing. The platform at Cedar Falls station was smaller than Margaret had expected, with perhaps a dozen people, waiting for arriving passengers and freight. Through the window, she could see a tall man in his 30s, wearing a dark suit and hat, standing slightly apart from the other greeters, with the kind of patient composure that suggested he was accustomed to waiting for important arrivals. Thomas Mitchell was exactly as she had imagined him from his letters. Solid and dependable in appearance, with the kind of weathered hands and direct gaze that spoke of someone who had earned his success through honest work. But there was also something in his expression as he scanned the train cars that suggested nervous anticipation, reminding Margaret that she was not the only person whose future was at stake in this meeting. As the train shuddered to a complete stop, and the conductor began calling for passengers to disembark, Margaret gathered her few possessions and lifted Elizabeth with the careful movements of someone who had learned to manage an infant while maintaining the appearance of complete incompetence. The moment had arrived when months of careful planning and correspondence would be tested against the reality of face-to-face interaction with a man who had agreed to marry a woman he had never met. The lies she had constructed would need to withstand not just casual conversation, but the intimate scrutiny of daily life with someone whose own honesty would make her deception increasingly difficult to maintain. But the alternative was to return to Chicago with a child whose very existence marked them both as outcasts from respectable society, facing a future that offered no realistic hope for security or advancement. As Margaret stepped onto the platform at Cedar Falls station with Elizabeth in her arms, she was committed to a course of action that would either provide them with the family and stability they needed, or expose them to a level of public shame that could destroy any chance for happiness in their new community. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Thomas Mitchell's first glimpse of Margaret Sullivan confirmed everything her letters had suggested about her character, while simultaneously introducing questions that her correspondence had not prepared him to address. The woman who stepped onto the Cedar Falls platform possessed the composed dignity he had expected, but she also carried an infant whose presence immediately complicated his understanding of their arrangement. "Miss Sullivan," Thomas approached with the careful courtesy his mother had drilled into him during childhood, removing his hat despite the cool September breeze. "I'm Thomas Mitchell. I hope your journey from Chicago wasn't too difficult." Margaret's smile was warm, but carried an edge of nervousness that seemed entirely appropriate for someone meeting her future husband for the first time. "Mr. Mitchell, It's such a pleasure to finally meet you in person. Your letters made me feel as though I already knew Cedar Falls quite well. The baby in her arms stirred at the sound of voices, opening dark eyes that seemed to take in the unfamiliar surroundings with the alert curiosity of a healthy 3-month-old. Thomas found himself studying the child's features while trying to reconcile her presence with the carefully worded explanation Margaret had provided in her final letter from Chicago. "This must be little Elizabeth," Thomas said, extending a gentle finger toward the baby, who grasped it with the automatic reflex that never failed to charm adults. "You mentioned in your letter that you had agreed to care for your friend's child. I hope the responsibility hasn't made your travels more difficult than necessary." Margaret's response came with the practiced smoothness of someone who had rehearsed this moment countless times during the long train journey from Chicago. "Elizabeth has been wonderfully well behaved. The poor dear lost her mother to consumption just 2 weeks ago, and there was simply no one else capable of providing proper care. I couldn't bear the thought of her being placed in an institution when I was able to offer a loving home." The explanation was plausible and demonstrated exactly the kind of charitable nature that Thomas had hoped to find in a wife. But something in Margaret's delivery suggested a level of emotional investment that seemed unusual for someone who had known the child for only a few weeks. The way she held Elizabeth, the natural rhythm of her movements as she adjusted the baby's blanket, and the protective quality of her voice when speaking about the child's needs all suggested a relationship that extended beyond temporary caretaking. "Of course, you did the right thing," Thomas replied, though his merchant's instincts were beginning to register subtle inconsistencies between Margaret's story and her behavior. "Elizabeth is fortunate to have someone willing to take responsibility for her welfare. I hope you know that my home is large enough to accommodate a child, and that I would never expect you to abandon your charitable obligations." The relief that flickered across Margaret's features was genuine and immediate, suggesting that she had been genuinely uncertain about his reaction to Elizabeth's presence. But it was also more intense than the situation seemed to warrant, carrying an emotional weight that implied personal stakes beyond those of a temporary guardian. Thomas gathered Margaret's modest collection of luggage while she settled Elizabeth in her arms for the short walk to his wagon. The Cedar Falls station served a community of fewer than 800 residents, and their arrival had not gone unnoticed by the local population. Thomas was acutely aware of the curious glances being directed toward his future bride and her unexpected charge, knowing that news of their arrival would be circulating throughout the community before evening. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, the station master's wife and Cedar Falls's unofficial coordinator of social information, approached with the kind of determined friendliness that made refusal impossible. "Thomas Mitchell, aren't you going to introduce us to your lovely bride?" The introduction provided Thomas with his first opportunity to observe Margaret's social skills under pressure. Her responses to Mrs. Hartwell's questions were perfectly appropriate, striking the right balance between friendliness and reserve while providing just enough information to satisfy curiosity without encouraging excessive familiarity. "What a precious baby," Mrs. Hartwell observed, reaching out to stroke Elizabeth's cheek with the automatic gesture of someone who had raised 6 children of her own. "She has the most distinctive features. Those dark eyes are quite striking against her fair complexion." Margaret's response came without hesitation, but Thomas noticed a slight tension in her posture that suggested careful attention to her words. "Elizabeth's mother was known for her beauty. The poor dear seems to have inherited her mother's best features along with her gentle temperament." The comment was skillfully crafted to deflect further inquiry while providing information that would satisfy immediate curiosity. But Thomas found himself studying Elizabeth's features more carefully. noting qualities that seemed to suggest aristocratic breeding rather than the working-class background that Margaret's story implied. The 15-minute wagon ride from the station to Thomas's farm provided their first opportunity for private conversation, though Elizabeth's presence prevented the kind of intimate discussion that might have addressed some of Thomas's growing questions about Margaret's background and circumstances. Instead, their conversation focused on practical matters: the layout of the farmhouse, the daily routines that governed rural life, and the social customs of Cedar Falls that would help Margaret integrate into the community. Margaret's questions demonstrated genuine interest in her new environment, but they also revealed a level of sophistication that seemed inconsistent with the simple working woman she had described in her letters. Her observations about the quality of farmland they passed showed understanding of agriculture that extended beyond casual interest, while her comments about the architecture of various houses suggested familiarity with construction techniques and design principles that most seamstresses would not possess. Thomas's farmhouse occupied a slight rise overlooking the Platte River Valley, surrounded by mature oak trees that provided both windbreak protection and aesthetic appeal. The two-story structure had been built by his father according to plans imported from Pennsylvania, featuring the kind of solid construction and thoughtful design that spoke of prosperity and permanence. "It's beautiful, Thomas," Margaret said, as they approached the front gate, and her appreciation seemed entirely genuine. "Much grander than I had expected. Your letters were too modest in describing your home." The interior of the house confirmed Margaret's assessment, while simultaneously introducing her to the domestic challenges she would face as the wife of a prosperous farmer. The rooms were larger and better appointed than anything she had experienced in Chicago boarding houses, but they also showed clear evidence of masculine occupation and the absence of feminine attention to domestic details. Thomas had obviously made an effort to prepare for her arrival, with fresh flowers in the front parlor and evidence of recent cleaning throughout the main floor, but Margaret's experienced eye immediately catalogued dozens of improvements that could transform the house from comfortable bachelor quarters into the kind of refined family home that would reflect well on both of them. "I've prepared the front bedroom for your use until after our wedding," Thomas explained, while carrying her luggage upstairs. "I thought you might prefer privacy for yourself and Elizabeth while you adjust to your new surroundings." The bedroom was spacious and well lit, with windows overlooking the farm's main fields, and furniture that, while masculine in design, was of obvious quality and good repair. Most importantly, from Margaret's perspective, it contained a large wardrobe and dressing area that would accommodate her clothing and Elizabeth's needs, while providing the privacy necessary for maintaining her carefully constructed deception. As Thomas helped her settle into the room, Margaret began the delicate process of establishing the domestic arrangements that would govern their relationship until their wedding ceremony, scheduled for the following Saturday at Cedar Falls Methodist Church. Her suggestions were tactful and practical, demonstrating understanding of proper behavior for unmarried couples, while also addressing the practical challenges of caring for an infant in unfamiliar surroundings. "I hope you won't mind if Elizabeth's schedule occasionally disrupts household routines," Margaret said, while arranging the baby's few belongings in one corner of the room. "Infants require feeding every few hours, and she sometimes becomes fussy during the night when sleeping in new surroundings." Thomas's response revealed both his lack of experience with children and his willingness to adapt his routine to accommodate their needs. "I'm accustomed to early morning schedules due to farm work, so night disturbances won't be a significant problem. Is there anything specific you'll need for Elizabeth's care that I should obtain from town?" The question provided Margaret with an opportunity to demonstrate both her maternal competence and her consideration for Thomas's financial circumstances. Her requests were modest and practical, focused on basic necessities rather than luxuries, and accompanied by offers to contribute to expenses from her own small savings. But as they discussed domestic arrangements and childcare responsibilities, Thomas found himself increasingly puzzled by subtle inconsistencies in Margaret's behavior and knowledge. Her familiarity with infant care was obviously extensive, suggesting experience that extended beyond the few weeks she claimed to have been caring for Elizabeth. Her understanding of household management revealed training that seemed more comprehensive than what most working women would acquire, while her casual references to various consumer goods suggested exposure to quality merchandise that would be unusual for someone of modest means. More troubling was Elizabeth's behavior in Margaret's presence. The baby's responses were those of a child with her own mother rather than a temporary caretaker. Elizabeth's immediate calming when Margaret held her, her automatic turning toward Margaret's voice, and her obvious comfort with Margaret's handling all suggested a relationship that had developed over months rather than weeks. That evening, as Margaret prepared Elizabeth for sleep in their shared bedroom, Thomas sat in his study, reviewing the correspondence that had led to their arrangement. Margaret's letters, which had seemed so open and honest during their exchange, now appeared to contain carefully crafted omissions that raised questions about everything she had told him regarding her background and circumstances. The woman who had arrived in Cedar Falls was undoubtedly intelligent, capable, and genuinely caring toward the child in her charge. But she was also someone whose story contained elements that didn't align with her demonstrated knowledge, behavior, and relationship. With Elizabeth, Thomas found himself facing the uncomfortable possibility that his future wife was either remarkably naive about the implications of her story or deliberately concealing information that would fundamentally alter his understanding of their arrangement. As he listened to Margaret's gentle voice singing a lullaby to Elizabeth in the room above, Thomas wrestled with questions that had no easy answers. Should he confront her directly about his suspicions, risking the destruction of their relationship over what might be innocent misunderstandings? Should he investigate her background independently, betraying the trust that should form the foundation of their marriage? Or should he proceed with their wedding while hoping that time and intimacy would eventually reveal whatever truths she was concealing? The decision he made would determine not only the future of their relationship, but also the kind of man he would prove himself to be when faced with circumstances that tested his values of honesty, trust, and compassion against his desire for the family and companionship that Margaret and Elizabeth represented. The following morning brought Thomas his first opportunity to observe Margaret's domestic capabilities under normal circumstances, and what he discovered both impressed and further puzzled him. By the time he returned from his early morning chores in the barn, she had transformed his utilitarian kitchen into something approaching the refined efficiency he remembered from his mother's management of household affairs. Margaret had obviously risen well before dawn to accomplish what she had achieved. Fresh bread was cooling on the counter, filling the kitchen with an aroma that spoke of skill far beyond basic competence. Coffee brewed with the perfect strength that suggested understanding of his preferences despite having never prepared it for him before. Most remarkably, she had somehow managed these accomplishments while caring for Elizabeth, who sat contentedly in an improvised high chair constructed from farm supplies, with the kind of ingenuity that spoke of extensive experience with infant care. "Good morning, Thomas." Margaret greeted him with a smile that seemed genuinely pleased with her domestic achievements. "I hope you don't mind that I took some liberties with your kitchen arrangements. I found everything I needed, though I did have to improvise solutions for a few items." The breakfast she served exceeded anything Thomas had experienced since his mother's death 5 years earlier. The eggs were prepared exactly to his preference, despite his never having mentioned it. The bacon was sliced to the precise thickness that complemented rather than dominated the meal, and the bread was baked with a texture and flavor that rivaled the best productions of Cedar Falls' professional bakery. "This is exceptional, Margaret," Thomas said honestly, while watching her efficiently manage Elizabeth's feeding alongside serving his meal. "Your letters mentioned domestic skills, but this demonstrates expertise that goes well beyond basic competence." Margaret's response carried a note of pleasure that seemed entirely genuine, but Thomas noticed that she deflected specific questions about where she had acquired such advanced abilities. Her explanations referenced general experience rather than specific training, and she skillfully redirected conversation toward Thomas's plans for the day rather than dwelling on her own background. "I was hoping you might show me more of the farm operations today," Margaret suggested, while cleaning Elizabeth's face with the practiced efficiency of someone accustomed to managing infant meals. "Your letters described the wheat cultivation, but I'd love to understand how everything works together as a complete enterprise." The request demonstrated exactly the kind of interest in his livelihood that Thomas had hoped to find in a wife, but it also revealed knowledge of agricultural terminology that seemed inconsistent with her claimed background as a city seamstress. Her questions during their tour of the farm showed understanding of crop rotation, soil management, and equipment maintenance that suggested exposure to farming operations far beyond casual observation. As they walked through his fields, with Margaret carrying Elizabeth in a sling she had somehow constructed from household materials, Thomas found himself simultaneously impressed by her genuine interest and increasingly puzzled by the depth of her knowledge. Her observations about drainage patterns showed understanding of engineering principles, while her comments about equipment efficiency suggested familiarity with mechanical systems that most women would not possess. "You seem to understand farming operations quite well for someone who has lived in Chicago," Thomas observed carefully, testing her response to direct inquiry about her background. Margaret's answer came smoothly, but Thomas detected a slight hesitation that suggested careful consideration of her words. "My father worked for a machinery company that supplied equipment to rural areas. I often accompanied him on visits to farms when I was younger, before the family troubles that brought me to Chicago." The explanation was plausible and provided context for her knowledge, while also introducing additional personal history that she had not mentioned in her letters. But it also raised questions about why such relevant information had been omitted from their correspondence, particularly given Thomas's obvious interest in agricultural matters. That afternoon, while Thomas conducted business in town, Margaret had her first extended interaction with the women of Cedar Falls, when several neighbors arrived for what they described as a welcoming visit, but which was obviously an investigative mission designed to satisfy community curiosity about the new arrival. Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell led the delegation, accompanied by Mrs. Sarah Campbell, the minister's wife, and Mrs. Dorothy Peterson, whose husband owned Cedar Falls General Store. Their arrival provided Margaret with her first real test of her ability to maintain her carefully constructed story under the kind of sustained questioning that small-town women could apply when properly motivated. "What a lovely home Thomas has. Prepared for you," Mrs. Campbell observed, while examining the improvements Margaret had made to the front parlor during her single day of residence. "You've certainly brought a woman's touch to these rooms. Such elegant arrangements suggest considerable experience with household management." Margaret's responses demonstrated social skills that impressed her visitors while carefully avoiding specific details about her background that might invite unwanted scrutiny. She deflected personal questions by expressing interest in community affairs, asked thoughtful questions about church activities and local customs, and presented herself as someone eager to contribute to Cedar Falls's social fabric. "Elizabeth is such a beautiful baby," Mrs. Peterson commented while offering to hold the infant, who accepted the attention with the good nature that characterized her temperament. She has the most distinctive features, such unusual coloring for a child of working-class background. The observation was delivered with the kind of casual friendliness that concealed sharp attention to details that might reveal inconsistencies. In Margaret's story, Mrs. Peterson had raised 4 children and possessed the experienced eye that could detect subtleties of breeding and care that others might miss. Elizabeth's mother came from a family that had seen better circumstances before economic difficulties forced them into less fortunate situations. Margaret replied with the smooth confidence of someone who had anticipated such questions. Sometimes, good breeding shows itself despite material hardships. The response was skillfully crafted to acknowledge the baby's obvious quality while maintaining the basic structure of Margaret's story. But it also introduced additional complexity to her narrative that would need to be maintained consistently under future questioning. Mrs. Hartwell's contribution to the conversation revealed the efficiency of small-town information networks and the challenges Margaret would face in maintaining her deception within a community where everyone's business was common knowledge. "I've been corresponding with my sister in Chicago about various matters," Mrs. Hartwell mentioned with casual precision. "She's quite familiar with the city's working districts and the establishments that employ young women in respectable positions. Perhaps you're familiar with some of the same neighborhoods or businesses." The question was a subtle trap designed to test the accuracy of Margaret's claimed background through specific knowledge that could be verified through Mrs. Hartwell's Chicago connections. Margaret's response required careful navigation between providing enough detail to satisfy curiosity while avoiding specific claims that might be contradicted by independent investigation. Chicago is such a large city that working women often know very little about districts beyond their immediate neighborhoods, Margaret replied diplomatically. "My employment kept me quite busy, and I had little opportunity for social activities that might have brought me into contact with other working establishments." The conversation continued for nearly 2 hours, with Margaret successfully maintaining her composure and consistency while providing her visitors with enough information to satisfy immediate curiosity without revealing details that could expose her deception. But by the time the women departed, she was emotionally exhausted from the constant vigilance required to maintain her false narrative. That evening, as Margaret prepared Elizabeth for sleep, she reflected on the challenges she would face in maintaining her deception within a community where every aspect of her background would eventually be subjected to scrutiny. The women of Cedar Falls were clearly intelligent, observant, and connected to information networks that could potentially expose inconsistencies in her story if she made careless mistakes. More troubling was her growing awareness that Thomas himself was beginning to notice discrepancies between her claimed background and her demonstrated knowledge and behavior. His questions were becoming more specific and direct, suggesting that his initial acceptance of her story was giving way to the kind of systematic doubt that could lead to active investigation of her claims. Meanwhile, Thomas spent his evening in town, conducting his own careful inquiries about the possibility of verifying Margaret's background through Chicago connections. Cedar Falls might be a small community, but it was connected to larger urban centers through business relationships, family connections, and correspondence networks that could potentially provide information about Margaret's true circumstances. His conversation with James Morrison, who managed Cedar Falls' grain shipping operations and maintained extensive business contacts throughout the Midwest, revealed that verifying someone's Chicago background was not only possible, but relatively straightforward for someone willing to invest the time and expense required for proper investigation. Railroad companies maintain passenger records, and the larger employment agencies keep files on workers who have demonstrated exceptional skills, Morrison explained during their private conversation. A woman with the domestic capabilities your Margaret has shown would likely be known to the better agencies if she had been seeking employment through legitimate channels. The information was both encouraging and troubling. Encouraging because it suggested that Margaret's true background could be verified if necessary. Troubling because it implied that if Margaret was indeed deceiving him, the deception was sophisticated enough to require professional investigation rather than casual inquiry. As Thomas walked home through the cool September evening, he wrestled with fundamental questions about trust, verification, and the nature of the relationship he was building with a woman whose story was beginning to unravel under careful examination. The wedding was scheduled for Saturday, just 4 days away, and he needed to decide whether to proceed based on faith in Margaret's character or delay the ceremony until he could resolve his growing doubts about her honesty. The decision would require him to balance his desire for family and companionship against his deeply held belief that marriage should be founded on complete honesty between partners. But it would also force him to confront the possibility that the woman who had so quickly become important to him was either remarkably naive about the implications of her deception or deliberately manipulating his emotions for purposes he could not yet understand. Back at the farmhouse, Margaret sat by her bedroom window, holding Elizabeth while watching Thomas's lantern approach across the fields. She had successfully navigated her first full day in Cedar Falls, but the experience had made clear that maintaining her deception would require constant vigilance and increasingly sophisticated lies to cover the inconsistencies that observant. People were beginning to notice. The question that haunted her was whether Thomas would prove to be the kind of man who would accept her explanations based on trust, or whether his obvious intelligence and integrity would compel him to seek verification of her claims through methods that would inevitably expose the truth about Elizabeth's parentage and her own circumstances. Wednesday morning brought an unexpected visitor to the Mitchell farm that would shatter the careful equilibrium Margaret had been struggling to maintain. As she was hanging laundry behind the house while Elizabeth napped in her basket, a well-dressed gentleman in a black carriage approached the front gate with the kind of purposeful determination that suggested official business rather than social calling. Dr. Henry Blackwood had served as Cedar Falls physician for 12 years, but his arrival at the Mitchell farm had nothing to do with medical concerns. The telegram he carried in his coat pocket had arrived on the previous evening's train from Chicago, sent by a private investigator whose services were retained by one of Chicago's most prominent banking families. Mrs. Sullivan, Dr. Blackwood, called out as Margaret approached from behind the house, her arms full of wet linens and her expression curious rather than concerned. "I'm Dr. Blackwood, Cedar Falls physician. I wonder if I might have a word with you about a delicate matter that requires discretion." Margaret's response was immediate and instinctive, her composure maintained through sheer force of will, despite the sudden terror that gripped her at the mention of delicate matters requiring discretion. "Of course, Dr. Blackwood. Perhaps we could speak in the front parlor? I have an infant who is napping, so I'll need to remain where I can hear if she wakes." The doctor's examination of Elizabeth's sleeping form was brief but professional, conducted with the practiced eye of someone who had delivered hundreds of babies and could recognize subtle indicators of breeding, care, and approximate age that escaped casual observation. What he saw confirmed the information contained in the telegram while raising additional questions about Margaret's circumstances and motivations. Mrs. Sullivan, I received correspondence from Chicago regarding inquiries about a young woman traveling with an infant under circumstances that have caused concern among certain parties. Dr. Blackwood began with the careful diplomacy of someone accustomed to delivering difficult news. I'm hoping you might clarify some details about your recent departure from Chicago and your current situation. The words struck Margaret like physical blows, though she managed to maintain her external composure through years of practice in concealing her emotions under pressure. The private investigator's reach extending to Cedar Falls meant that Jonathan Whitmore's family was not content to simply drive her from Chicago, but was actively pursuing her to ensure that she could never threaten their reputation through future claims about Elizabeth's parentage. I'm not certain what inquiries you're referring to, Dr. Blackwood, Margaret replied with studied calm, while her mind raced through possible responses that might deflect his investigation without providing information that could be used against her. I left Chicago to marry Mr. Mitchell, bringing with me the orphaned child of a deceased friend. Perhaps there's been some confusion about the circumstances. Dr. Blackwood's expression showed that he was not entirely convinced by her explanation, but also that he was not unsympathetic to whatever difficulties she might be facing. His years of medical practice had brought him into contact with women whose circumstances required careful protection from social judgment and legal complications. The correspondence suggests that certain parties in Chicago are concerned about the welfare of a child who may have been removed from their influence without proper legal authorization. He continued diplomatically. I'm hoping to clarify whether any such concerns might be warranted or whether this is simply a case of mistaken identity. The conversation was interrupted by Thomas's return from his morning business in town, his arrival creating a tactical situation that required Margaret to make split-second decisions about how much truth to reveal and to whom. The presence of Dr. Blackwood, obviously conducting serious business with his future wife, demanded explanation, while the doctor's knowledge of Chicago inquiries suggested that concealment was no longer a viable option. Dr. Blackwood, Thomas greeted the physician, with obvious surprise and growing concern. I hope there's no medical emergency that requires your attention. Margaret and the baby both seemed perfectly healthy this morning. The doctor's response revealed the complexity of the situation, while placing both Thomas and Margaret in positions that would require immediate decisions about trust, honesty, and the future of their relationship. Mr. Mitchell, I've been asked to make some inquiries regarding Mrs. Sullivan's recent departure from Chicago and the circumstances surrounding the child in her care, Dr. Blackwood explained with professional neutrality. Perhaps we might discuss this matter privately, as it may involve considerations that affect your upcoming marriage. Thomas's reaction was immediate and protective, revealing character traits that both impressed and terrified Margaret in equal measure. His first instinct was to defend her against what he clearly perceived as unwelcome intrusion into their private affairs. But his second was to seek complete understanding of whatever circumstances had prompted official inquiry into Margaret's background. Margaret is my intended wife, and any concerns about her circumstances are matters that should be addressed directly to both of us, Thomas stated firmly, while positioning himself between Margaret and the doctor in a gesture of physical protection that spoke of instinctive loyalty. If there are questions about her background or the child's welfare, I believe we have the right to understand exactly what accusations are being made and by whom. Dr. Blackwood's response to Thomas's challenge revealed both the seriousness of the Chicago inquiries and the potential legal implications of Margaret's presence in Cedar Falls with Elizabeth. The information he shared would force immediate decisions from both Margaret and Thomas about how to proceed with their relationship under circumstances that neither had anticipated. The inquiries originate from the Whitmore banking family of Chicago, regarding a child they claim was born to a woman in their employ, under circumstances that involve questions of paternity and legal custody, Dr. Blackwood explained with clinical precision. And they have provided physical descriptions of both the woman and child that closely match Mrs. Sullivan and the infant in her care. The name Whitmore struck Margaret like a physical blow, though she managed to maintain her composure through sheer force of will. The fact that Jonathan's family was actively pursuing her meant that they considered Elizabeth's existence a genuine threat to their reputation and were prepared to use legal means to ensure their protection. Thomas's reaction to this information revealed both his intelligence and his integrity, as he immediately grasped the implications of what Dr. Blackwood was suggesting, while also recognizing that Margaret's response to these accusations would determine the future of their relationship. "Margaret," Thomas said quietly, his voice carrying a combination of concern and growing understanding that made concealment impossible to maintain, "I think it's time for complete honesty about your circumstances in Chicago and your relationship to Elizabeth. Whatever the truth might be, we need to understand it fully before proceeding further." The moment Margaret had dreaded since beginning her correspondence with Thomas had finally arrived, forcing her to choose between maintaining her deception in the face of overwhelming evidence or revealing the truth about Elizabeth's parentage and her own circumstances. The decision would determine not only her own future, but also Elizabeth's welfare and Thomas's position within his community. "Thomas, Dr. Blackwood," Margaret began, with the quiet dignity of someone who had finally decided to stop running from the truth. "Elizabeth is not the orphan child of a deceased friend. She is my daughter, born 3 months ago in Chicago, under circumstances that made it impossible for us to remain there safely." The admission brought immediate relief from the exhaustion of maintaining constant deception, but it also introduced questions about Elizabeth's paternity that would test Thomas's character and Dr. Blackwood's discretion in ways that could affect all their futures. Thomas's response to Margaret's revelation demonstrated exactly the kind of character that had attracted her to him through their correspondence, but it also revealed the complexity of the situation they now faced together. "Margaret, I appreciate your honesty, though I wish it had come sooner," Thomas said with careful control of his emotions. "The question now is whether Elizabeth's father poses any continuing threat to your safety or our ability to build a life together here in Cedar Falls." Dr. Blackwood's medical training had prepared him to handle sensitive information with appropriate discretion, but the involvement of one of Chicago's most powerful families in pursuing Margaret and Elizabeth suggested complications that exceeded normal domestic disputes. "Mrs. Sullivan, if the Whitmore family is indeed pursuing you through private investigators, they obviously consider your presence elsewhere to be a threat to their interests," Dr. Blackwood observed with professional concern. "Perhaps you could help us understand what resources they might bring to bear in attempting to compel your return to Chicago or secure custody of the child." Margaret's response would reveal the full scope of the danger she and Elizabeth faced, while also testing Thomas's willingness to involve himself in a conflict with adversaries whose wealth and influence could affect his own standing in the community. Jonathan Whitmore III is Elizabeth's father, though he has never acknowledged the relationship and has threatened legal action against anyone who attempts to establish it publicly, Margaret explained, with the weary honesty of someone who had finally stopped pretending. His family's influence extends throughout Chicago's legal and social systems, making any attempt to seek justice or support a futile gesture that would likely result in complete destruction of anyone who opposed them. The revelation of Elizabeth's parentage placed all 3 adults in a situation that required immediate decisions about how to protect the child's welfare, while managing the political and legal implications of defying one of the Midwest's most powerful families. Thomas's response would determine whether Margaret had found the ally and protector she desperately needed, or whether her honesty had destroyed her last hope for building a safe and respectable life for herself and her daughter. "Margaret, I need to understand one more thing," Thomas said with the careful precision of someone making decisions that would affect the rest of his life. "Are you seeking marriage to me as a means of escape from the Whitmore family's threats? Or do you genuinely believe we could build a partnership based on mutual respect and affection, despite the deception that brought us together?" The question would require Margaret to examine her own motivations with complete honesty, while also recognizing that Thomas deserved truth about her feelings as well as her circumstances. Margaret's answer to Thomas's crucial question came with the kind of raw honesty that can only emerge when all pretense has been stripped away, and survival depends on complete truth between people who have chosen to trust each other against overwhelming odds. "Thomas, I cannot deny that I initially sought marriage as an escape from circumstances that left me with no other viable options," Margaret said, while meeting his gaze directly, her voice steady despite the trembling in her hands. "But in the days since arriving here, I've discovered that you are exactly the kind of man I had hoped but never dared to believe I might find. My feelings for you have grown beyond gratitude or convenience into something that I believe could become genuine love given the opportunity to flourish." The response demonstrated exactly the combination of honesty and vulnerability that Thomas had been hoping to find beneath Margaret's carefully constructed facade. Her admission of initial deception was painful but necessary, while her expression of developing feelings offered hope that their relationship could survive the crisis that threatened to destroy it before it had truly begun. Dr. Blackwood observed this exchange with the professional detachment of someone who had witnessed countless human dramas unfold in his medical practice, but also with growing respect for both Margaret's courage in revealing the truth and Thomas's response to information that would have driven many men to immediate rejection of further involvement. "If I may interject," Dr. Blackwood said with careful diplomacy, "the immediate concern is not the authenticity of your feelings for each other, but rather the practical steps that must be taken to protect Mrs. Sullivan and her daughter from whatever actions the Whitmore family might pursue to secure their objectives." The doctor's words refocused their attention on the immediate dangers they faced, while also suggesting that he was prepared to involve himself in their protection rather than simply delivering unwelcome news and departing. His willingness to provide assistance would prove crucial in developing strategies that could counter the resources and influence that the Whitmore family was obviously prepared to deploy. Thomas's response revealed both his tactical intelligence and his fundamental decency as he immediately began analyzing their situation with the systematic approach of someone accustomed to solving complex agricultural and business problems under pressure. "Dr. Blackwood, what specific actions do you believe the Whitmore family might take to compel Margaret's return to Chicago or secure custody of Elizabeth?" Thomas asked, while unconsciously positioning himself closer to Margaret in a gesture of protection that spoke of instinctive loyalty. "Understanding their capabilities will help us develop appropriate countermeasures." The physician's answer revealed both the scope of the threat they faced and the limited options available for resisting the influence of one of the Midwest's most powerful families. The Whitmore banking interests extend throughout the region, giving them influence over legal proceedings, business relationships, and political decisions that could affect anyone who opposes their objectives, Dr. Blackwood explained with clinical precision. They could potentially use federal interstate commerce laws to claim that Elizabeth was transported across state lines illegally, or they might pursue custody proceedings based on claims of superior financial resources and social standing. The information was sobering, but not entirely discouraging, as it suggested that the Whitmore family's actions would need to follow legal procedures that could be challenged by competent counsel rather than simply relying on intimidation and economic pressure. Margaret's contribution to their strategic discussion demonstrated both her intelligence and her detailed knowledge of the Whitmore family's methods and vulnerabilities. Jonathan's father, Harrison Whitmore II, is extremely concerned about public scandal that might affect the family's banking relationships or political connections, Margaret explained, while Elizabeth slept peacefully in her arms, oblivious to the adult complications surrounding her future. They would prefer to resolve this matter quietly, rather than risk publicity that might invite unwanted scrutiny of their business practices or personal conduct. This insight suggested potential leverage that could be used to discourage aggressive pursuit, while also indicating that direct confrontation might be less effective than strategic maneuvering designed to make continued harassment more costly than beneficial. Thomas's response revealed both his growing commitment to protecting Margaret and Elizabeth and his understanding of the community resources that might be mobilized to support their cause. Cedar Falls may be a small community, but we have our own political connections and legal resources that might prove more formidable than the Whitmore family expects, Thomas observed, while his mind obviously worked through possibilities for resistance and protection. Judge William Porter has served this district for 20 years and takes a dim view of powerful interests attempting to intimidate local residents. Dr. Blackwood's expression suggested that he was familiar with Judge Porter's reputation and believed that local legal support might indeed prove effective in countering the Whitmore family's influence, particularly if their case could be presented. In terms of protecting a young mother and child from harassment by distant powerful interests, Judge Porter has grandchildren of his own and has consistently demonstrated protective instincts toward families facing difficulties, Dr. Blackwood confirmed. If we can present this situation as an attempt by Chicago interests to separate a mother from her child through legal manipulation, we might find considerable local sympathy for your cause. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of James Morrison, whose grain shipping business had brought him to the Mitchell farm on routine matters, but whose timing would prove fortuitous for their developing plans. Morrison's extensive business connections throughout the Midwest region could provide both information about Whitmore family activities and potential allies in resisting their influence. "Thomas, I hope I'm not interrupting important discussions," Morrison said as he approached the group gathered on the front porch, his expression showing curiosity about Dr. Blackwood's presence and the obvious seriousness of their conversation. Thomas's decision to include Morrison in their discussion demonstrated both his trust in the businessman's discretion and his recognition that building effective resistance to the Whitmore family's pressure would require community support and resources beyond what he could provide individually. "James, we're dealing with a situation that involves threats from Chicago interests against Margaret and her daughter," Thomas explained with careful brevity. "Dr. Blackwood has received inquiries from private investigators working for the Whitmore banking family, and we're discussing how to protect our family from whatever pressure they might bring to bear." Morrison's reaction to the mention of the Whitmore name was immediate and informed, revealing that his business activities had brought him into contact with their operations and given him detailed knowledge of their methods and influence. The Whitmore family controls significant grain shipping contracts throughout the region, but they've also earned a reputation for using their economic influence to intimidate competitors and business partners, Morrison said with obvious distaste for their practices. However, their influence depends largely on people being unwilling to challenge them publicly. Direct confrontation might prove more effective than they expect. This information provided crucial intelligence about their adversaries' strengths and vulnerabilities, while also suggesting that resistance might be more feasible than initially apparent. Morrison's willingness to involve himself in challenging the Whitmore family's interests indicated that Thomas and Margaret would not be fighting alone against overwhelmingly superior resources. Dr. Blackwood's contribution to their expanding alliance demonstrated the professional and social networks that could be mobilized to protect community members from external threats. I maintain correspondence with physicians throughout the region who serve communities where Whitmore business interests operate, Dr. Blackwood explained. There may be other cases of their using intimidation tactics against individuals who pose inconvenient complications to their objectives. Documentation of a pattern of harassment could prove valuable in legal proceedings. Margaret's growing hope was tempered by realistic assessment of the dangers they still faced, but the emergence of local allies willing to challenge the Whitmore family's influence suggested that her desperate flight from Chicago might have led to exactly the kind of protection and support she had never dared to hope for. I cannot adequately express my gratitude for your willingness to involve yourselves in circumstances that could bring you into conflict with such powerful adversaries, Margaret said with obvious emotion. Elizabeth and I have been running from forces that seemed impossible to resist, but your support offers hope that we might finally find safety and the opportunity to build the kind of life we both deserve. Thomas's response demonstrated both his personal commitment to Margaret and Elizabeth and his understanding of the broader principles at stake in their conflict with the Whitmore family. Margaret, you and Elizabeth are part of this community now, and Cedar Falls protects its own against anyone who would threaten our families, Thomas declared with quiet determination. The Whitmore family may have wealth and influence, but they don't have the right to destroy innocent lives in pursuit of their own convenience. The afternoon's discussion concluded with specific assignments for each member of their emerging alliance. Dr. Blackwood would use his medical professional networks to gather intelligence about other Whitmore family activities that might reveal patterns of intimidation or illegal behavior. Morrison would leverage his business connections to identify potential allies and assess the economic leverage that could be brought to bear against Whitmore interests. Thomas would consult with Judge Porter about legal strategies for protecting Margaret's custody rights, while also exploring the possibility of filing countercharges based on harassment and intimidation. Most importantly, they would accelerate plans for Thomas and Margaret's wedding ceremony, recognizing that marriage would provide additional legal protection for both Margaret and Elizabeth, while also demonstrating community support for their relationship. As their allies departed to begin implementing their protective strategies, Margaret and Thomas found themselves alone for the first time since Dr. Blackwood's arrival had forced the revelation of all her carefully guarded secrets. The conversation that followed would determine whether their relationship could survive the transition from romantic correspondence to partnership in facing genuine danger from powerful adversaries. Margaret, I want you to understand that my commitment to you and Elizabeth is not based on sympathy or obligation, but on genuine respect for your character and determination, Thomas said, while holding her hand with gentle firmness. You've demonstrated remarkable courage in protecting your daughter and seeking a better life for both of you. Those are exactly the qualities I hope to find in a wife and partner. The assurance provided Margaret with emotional stability she had not experienced since Elizabeth's birth, while also confirming that her desperate gamble in seeking marriage to a stranger had led to exactly the kind of man she had needed, but never expected to find. Thursday morning brought news that would transform their defensive strategy into something far more complex and dangerous than anyone had anticipated. Sheriff Benjamin Clark arrived at the Mitchell farm, carrying official documents that had been delivered by the morning train, along with information that would reveal the true scope of the Whitmore family's determination to reclaim control over Elizabeth's future. Thomas, I'm afraid I have some troubling news regarding your intended bride and the child in her care, Sheriff Clark announced, with the grave formality of someone delivering official business that he personally found distasteful. I've received a federal warrant for Margaret Sullivan's arrest on charges of interstate kidnapping and child endangerment, issued at the request of Chicago authorities acting on behalf of the Whitmore family. The warrant represented a devastating escalation of the conflict that exceeded anything their newly formed alliance had anticipated. Federal charges would remove the case from local jurisdiction, where they had hoped to find sympathetic treatment, placing Margaret's fate in the hands of federal courts, where the Whitmore family's political connections could prove decisive. Margaret's response to this news demonstrated both her courage and her realistic understanding of the legal and political forces arrayed against her. Rather than collapsing into despair or panic, she immediately began analyzing the implications of the charges while considering how they might be countered through legal and public relations strategies that had not yet been fully explored. Sheriff Clark, may I examine the specific language of the charges? Margaret asked with remarkable composure, considering that her freedom and Elizabeth's welfare were now in immediate jeopardy. Understanding exactly what accusations have been made will help us develop appropriate responses to these claims. The warrant's language revealed both the sophistication of the Whitmore family's legal strategy and potential vulnerabilities that could be exploited by competent defense counsel. The charges were carefully crafted to appear protective of Elizabeth's welfare, while avoiding any direct acknowledgement of Jonathan Whitmore's paternity that might expose the family to uncomfortable publicity. The warrant claims that Margaret Sullivan unlawfully removed a minor child from the legal custody of her legitimate guardians in Chicago and transported her across state lines for purposes of avoiding legal proceedings related to the child's welfare, Sheriff Clark read with obvious reluctance. It further alleges that the defendant has assumed false identity as the child's mother to avoid detection and accountability for her actions. The charges were legally serious but factually problematic, containing assumptions and claims that could be challenged through evidence and testimony that the Whitmore family might prefer not to present in public proceedings. Their decision to pursue federal charges suggested both confidence in their political connections and desperation to resolve the situation quickly before it could develop into prolonged public scrutiny. Thomas's reaction to the warrant revealed both his protective instincts and his strategic intelligence, as he immediately began identifying the resources and allies that would be necessary to mount effective resistance to federal prosecution. Sheriff Clark, what timeline are we dealing with for Margaret's arrest and transportation to federal custody? Thomas asked, while positioning himself between Margaret and the sheriff in a gesture that demonstrated his unwavering support despite the official nature of the charges. I assume she has the right to legal representation and appropriate time to arrange her affairs before being taken into custody. Sheriff Clark's response revealed both his personal sympathy for their situation and his professional obligations. Under federal law that limited his discretionary authority in handling the warrant's execution. Thomas, I have to take her into custody today, but I can delay the actual arrest until this evening to give you time to arrange legal counsel and make provisions for the child's care, Sheriff Clark explained with obvious reluctance. Judge Porter has already been contacted about appointing emergency custody arrangements for Elizabeth, and he's expressed willingness to consider temporary placement with local families pending resolution of the legal proceedings. The mention of Elizabeth being placed in emergency custody struck Margaret with terror that exceeded even her fear of imprisonment. The thought of being separated from her daughter while facing federal charges in a distant jurisdiction represented exactly the kind of separation that the Whitmore family was obviously hoping to achieve through legal manipulation. "Sheriff, surely there must be provisions for keeping a nursing mother with her infant child during legal proceedings," Margaret said with desperate urgency. "Elizabeth is still completely dependent on nursing for her nutrition, and separation from her mother would constitute genuine endangerment of her health and welfare." Dr. Blackwood's arrival at this critical moment would prove fortuitous for Margaret's immediate needs and their long-term strategy for resisting the Whitmore family's legal assault. His medical expertise and professional standing would provide crucial support for Margaret's claims about Elizabeth's nursing requirements, while also introducing new information about the case that would fundamentally alter their understanding of the forces involved. "Sheriff Clark, Dr. Blackwood." Thomas greeted the physician while helping Margaret maintain her composure despite the devastating news of her impending arrest. "Dr. Blackwood, we've just learned that Margaret faces federal charges related to Elizabeth's custody. Your medical opinion about separating a nursing mother from her infant could be crucial in ensuring the child's welfare during these proceedings." Dr. Blackwood's response would demonstrate both his professional integrity and his commitment to protecting Margaret and Elizabeth from legal manipulation that could endanger the child's health and development. From a medical standpoint, separating a 3-month-old infant from her nursing mother would constitute genuine endangerment of the child's health and could result in serious nutritional and emotional trauma, Dr. Blackwood stated with professional authority. "I would be prepared to testify in any legal proceeding that such separation would be contrary to the child's medical needs and welfare." But Dr. Blackwood's most significant contribution to their crisis would come from unexpected information. He had received through his professional networks information that would reveal the true scope of the Whitmore family's legal vulnerability and provide new strategies for challenging their accusations. "However, I believe I have information that may prove even more valuable in challenging these charges," Dr. Blackwood continued with the careful precision of someone revealing professionally sensitive information. "My correspondence with colleagues in Chicago has revealed that this is not the first case involving accusations of harassment and intimidation by the Whitmore family against women who have posed inconvenient complications to their business or personal interests. The revelation that other women had faced similar treatment from the Whitmore family opened possibilities for building a defense based on demonstrating a pattern of abuse rather than simply challenging the specific charges against Margaret. Documentation of systematic harassment could transform the case from individual criminal proceedings into a broader examination of the Whitmore family's methods and practices. Sheriff Clark's reaction to this information suggested that he was not entirely comfortable with his role in executing a warrant that might be part of a larger pattern of legal manipulation designed to protect powerful interests rather than serve justice. "Dr. Blackwood, if you have evidence of similar cases involving the Whitmore family, that information could be relevant to determining whether these charges represent legitimate law enforcement concerns or abuse of federal legal processes for private purposes," Sheriff Clark observed with growing interest. "Federal prosecutors don't appreciate being used to settle private disputes, particularly when doing so might expose them to accusations of favoritism toward wealthy and politically connected families." The afternoon brought a flurry of activity as their alliance expanded to include additional legal and political resources that could challenge the federal charges while protecting Margaret from immediate imprisonment. Judge Porter's involvement proved crucial in establishing temporary arrangements that would keep Elizabeth with her mother while legal proceedings moved forward. More significantly, James Morrison's business connections revealed potential allies, whose own conflicts with Whitmore business practices had given them both motivation and resources to support challenges to the family's influence and methods. I've been in contact with grain elevator operators throughout Nebraska and Iowa who have experienced economic pressure and legal intimidation from Whitmore banking interests, Morrison reported during an emergency meeting at the Mitchell farm. Several of them have been considering coordinated legal action against what they consider monopolistic and predatory business practices. This information suggested possibilities for building a broad coalition of interests opposed to Whitmore family practices, transforming Margaret's individual case into part of a larger legal and political challenge that could provide both protection and leverage for negotiations. The day's most significant development came from an unexpected source when Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell arrived with information that her Chicago correspondents had revealed about the Whitmore family's current situation and their motivation for pursuing Margaret with such determination. My sister's letters indicate that the Whitmore family is currently facing federal investigation into their banking practices and political connections. Mrs. Hartwell reported with obvious satisfaction at being able to contribute crucial intelligence to their efforts. Apparently, there are questions about their compliance with interstate banking regulations and their use of political influence to secure favorable treatment from federal regulators. The revelation that the Whitmore family was already under federal scrutiny for their business practices provided exactly the leverage that their alliance needed to challenge the charges against Margaret, while also explaining the family's desperation to resolve potential scandals quickly and quietly. As evening approached and Sheriff Clark prepared to execute the arrest warrant, Margaret faced the prospect of imprisonment with courage that impressed everyone involved in supporting her cause. But she also carried hope that the resources and allies they had assembled could challenge the charges successfully while protecting Elizabeth's welfare and exposing the Whitmore family's abuse of legal processes for private gain. Thomas, regardless of what happens in the coming days or weeks, I want you to know that finding you and this community has given Elizabeth and me something we never expected to discover, Margaret said while preparing for her arrest with dignity that honored both her character and their developing relationship. You've shown us that there are still places in this world where justice and decency can prevail over wealth and political influence. The arrest would take place that evening, but it would occur within a context of legal and political support that gave them realistic hope for successful resistance to charges that everyone involved recognized as legally questionable and morally unjustifiable. The battle against the Whitmore family's influence was just beginning, but it would be fought with resources and allies that could challenge even the most powerful adversaries. The Cedar Falls jail was not designed for female prisoners, particularly nursing mothers with infant children, but Sheriff Clark's creative interpretation of federal custody requirements allowed Margaret to remain with Elizabeth in the sheriff's private quarters while awaiting transport to Omaha for federal proceedings. This arrangement would prove crucial, not only for Elizabeth's welfare, but also for providing Margaret with access to the legal and strategic support that was rapidly organizing on her behalf. Attorney Daniel Webster Harrison arrived on Friday's morning train from Lincoln, carrying credentials that would fundamentally alter the legal landscape of Margaret's case. His law practice specialized in challenging federal overreach and defending individuals against what he termed prosecutorial abuse by politically connected interests. His involvement had been secured through Judge Porter's professional networks and would prove decisive in transforming defensive proceedings into an aggressive challenge to the Whitmore family's legal tactics. Mrs. Sullivan, I've reviewed the federal charges against you, and I believe we have substantial grounds for challenging both the legal basis for these accusations and the motivations behind their filing, Attorney Harrison announced during their first consultation in Sheriff Clark's office. More importantly, my preliminary investigation suggests that the Whitmore family may have made serious miscalculations in pursuing federal charges that could expose them to countercharges and unwelcome scrutiny of their own activities. Harrison's confidence was based on more than legal technicalities. His practice had brought him into contact with other victims of what he described as systematic intimidation campaigns by wealthy families using legal processes to silence inconvenient individuals. The documentation he had assembled revealed patterns of behavior that could transform Margaret's individual case into part of a broader legal challenge to abuse of federal court systems. The charges against you claim that you kidnapped a child from her legitimate guardians in Chicago, Harrison explained while reviewing the warrant's specific language. However, the federal prosecutors have failed to identify these supposed guardians or provide any documentation of legal custody arrangements that would give anyone other than you the right to determine Elizabeth's placement and care. This legal vulnerability was compounded by the Whitmore family's reluctance to acknowledge Jonathan's paternity publicly, creating a situation where they claimed custodial rights without admitting the biological relationship that would justify such claims. Their legal strategy depended on federal prosecutors accepting their assertions without demanding the kind of evidence that normal custody cases required. Margaret's contribution to developing their defense strategy demonstrated both her intelligence and her detailed knowledge of the Whitmore family's methods and vulnerabilities. Jonathan's father, Harrison Whitmore II, has built his entire political and business reputation on maintaining an image of moral superiority and family values, Margaret explained, while Elizabeth nursed contentedly in her arms. Public acknowledgement that his son fathered a child with an unmarried employee and then abandoned both mother and child would be devastating to the family's social standing and political connections. This insight provided the foundation for a defense strategy that would force the Whitmore family to choose between dropping the charges or exposing themselves to exactly the kind of public scandal they were desperate to avoid. Attorney Harrison's experience in such cases had taught him that wealthy families often overreached in their initial legal tactics, creating opportunities for skilled defense counsel to turn prosecutorial advantage into devastating exposure. The afternoon brought unexpected reinforcement for their legal position when a delegation of prominent Nebraska citizens arrived in Cedar Falls to offer support for Margaret's case. Judge William Porter had used his political connections to alert influential figures throughout the state about what he characterized as an attempt by out-of-state interests to abuse federal legal processes for private gain. Senator Robert Caldwell, whose political career had been built on opposition to monopolistic business practices, announced his intention to request a federal investigation into whether the charges against Margaret represented abuse of prosecutorial authority for the benefit of politically connected families. The use of federal kidnapping charges against a mother caring for her own child represents exactly the kind of legal manipulation that undermines public confidence in our justice system, Senator Caldwell declared during a press conference held on the steps of the Cedar Falls courthouse. If wealthy families can use political connections to weaponize federal law enforcement against individuals who pose inconvenient complications to their interests, then none of our citizens are safe from similar abuse. The senator's involvement transformed Margaret's case from a local legal matter into a political issue with statewide implications, providing media attention and political pressure that would make it difficult for federal prosecutors to proceed without thorough investigation of the charge's legitimacy. More significantly, Senator Caldwell's staff had uncovered federal banking regulation violations by Whitmore financial institutions that could result in criminal charges against family members if properly investigated and prosecuted. This information provided leverage that could be used to negotiate resolution of Margaret's case, while also exposing the Whitmore family to genuine legal jeopardy. Dr. Blackwood's continued investigation through medical professional networks had revealed additional cases involving women who had been intimidated by the Whitmore family through legal threats and economic pressure. 3 former employees of Whitmore-controlled businesses had experienced circumstances remarkably similar to Margaret's situation, including pregnancy by family members, followed by threats and forced departure from Chicago. The pattern of behavior is unmistakable, Dr. Blackwood reported during Friday evening's strategy session. The Whitmore family has consistently used their wealth and political connections to silence women who could expose their male family members to scandal or legal accountability. Margaret's case represents their most aggressive attempt to use federal law enforcement for these purposes, but it also represents their greatest exposure to public scrutiny and legal counterattack. James Morrison's Business Intelligence Network had identified specific grain elevator operators and farm equipment dealers who had been victims of Whitmore economic intimidation. Their willingness to provide testimony about systematic business practices that violated federal antitrust and banking regulations offered additional leverage for challenging the charges against Margaret while exposing the family to serious federal investigation. I've documented at least 12 cases of businesses being forced into bankruptcy or sale through coordinated pressure from Whitmore banking and shipping interests, Morrison reported with obvious satisfaction at being able to contribute substantial evidence to their cause. Federal prosecutors who investigate these patterns will discover violations that carry criminal penalties far more serious than the charges currently facing Margaret. The evening's most dramatic development came when Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell arrived with a visitor whose presence would revolutionize their understanding of the case and provide resources that could guarantee victory over the Whitmore family's legal assault. Catherine Whitmore Bradley, the estranged daughter of Harrison Whitmore II, had traveled from Denver upon learning about federal charges being filed against a woman whose situation paralleled her own experience with her family's methods of dealing with inconvenient scandals. "Mrs. Sullivan, my family destroyed my marriage and drove me from Chicago using the same tactics they're now employing against you," Catherine announced with quiet determination that spoke of years of planning for exactly this kind of confrontation. With her father's empire, "I've spent the last 8 years documenting their illegal activities and abuse of political connections, waiting for an opportunity to expose their methods to federal investigation." Catherine's testimony would prove devastating to any attempt by the Whitmore family to maintain their claims of moral authority and legitimate concern for Elizabeth's welfare. As Harrison Whitmore II's daughter, she possessed both intimate knowledge of family operations and legal standing that would make her testimony unassailable in federal court. "My father has used federal law enforcement connections to intimidate and silence at least 6 women who posed threats to family reputation through relationships with male family members," Catherine continued, while providing Attorney Harrison with detailed documentation she had assembled over years of careful investigation. "The charges against Mrs. Sullivan represent the culmination of a pattern of behavior that violates federal laws prohibiting abuse of legal processes for private gain." More significantly, Catherine's documentation included evidence of systematic violations of federal banking regulations, political corruption, and tax evasion that would expose multiple Whitmore family members to criminal prosecution if properly investigated by federal authorities. Attorney Harrison's review of Catherine's evidence confirmed that their defense strategy could now extend far beyond challenging the charges against Margaret to exposing a criminal enterprise that had operated for decades under protection of political connections and social influence. With this documentation, we can transform these proceedings from defensive responses to prosecutorial accusations into aggressive exposure of systematic criminal activity by the Whitmore family. Harrison announced with obvious excitement about the possibilities that Catherine's testimony had created. Federal prosecutors will find it impossible to proceed with charges against Margaret once they understand the true nature of the family's motivations and methods. As Friday evening concluded, Margaret found herself surrounded by allies and resources that exceeded anything she had dared to hope for when fleeing Chicago with Elizabeth 3 months earlier. The desperate gamble of seeking marriage to a stranger had led not only to personal safety and genuine love, but also to a confrontation with the Whitmore family that could expose their criminal activities and prevent future victims from experiencing similar abuse. Thomas's response to the day's developments demonstrated both his character and his growing understanding of the broader implications of their struggle against powerful interests that had operated without accountability for too long. Margaret, what began as our personal fight for family and happiness has become something much larger, Thomas observed while holding Elizabeth during their evening conversation. We now have the opportunity to ensure that no other women will face the kind of intimidation and abuse that drove you from Chicago. That's a responsibility we cannot take lightly. The trial preparation would continue through the weekend, but the foundation had been established for a legal and political confrontation that would either vindicate Margaret completely or expose the entire alliance to retaliation from one of the most powerful families in the Midwest. Monday morning's journey to Omaha for Margaret's federal court appearance became a procession that demonstrated the unprecedented level of support that had mobilized behind her cause. The special train car arranged by Senator Caldwell carried not only Margaret and her legal team, but also key witnesses whose testimony would transform the proceedings from simple criminal charges into a comprehensive exposure of the Whitmore family's decades-long pattern of criminal activity. Federal prosecutor James Thornton had arrived in Omaha expecting to handle a routine interstate kidnapping case involving a disturbed woman who had unlawfully taken a child from legitimate guardians. His preliminary review of the case file had revealed nothing that suggested unusual complexity or political sensitivity, and he had allocated minimal time and resources for what appeared to be straightforward federal charges. The first indication that his assumptions were fundamentally flawed came when he discovered that the defendant was represented by Daniel Webster Harrison, whose reputation for exposing prosecutorial misconduct and challenging federal overreach was well known throughout the federal court system. Harrison's involvement suggested either substantial financial resources behind the defendant or compelling evidence that the charges were legally or factually questionable. The second warning sign emerged when Senator Caldwell's office contacted the Federal District Attorney's Office, requesting immediate investigation into whether the charges against Margaret Sullivan represented abuse of federal prosecutorial authority for the benefit of politically connected private interests. The senator's formal request included specific allegations about the Whitmore family's use of federal law enforcement connections for purposes unrelated to legitimate criminal justice concerns. But Prosecutor Thornton's greatest shock came when he received Attorney Harrison's preliminary discovery motions, which included documentation of systematic criminal activity by the Whitmore family that could result in federal racketeering charges, banking regulation violations, and conspiracy. Prosecutions that would dwarf the significance of any charges against Margaret Sullivan. Your Honor, the defense's discovery requests appear to extend far beyond the scope of the charges against the defendant, Prosecutor Thornton protested during Monday morning's preliminary hearing before Federal Judge Patricia Morrison. These Motion seemed designed to transform simple kidnapping charges into a fishing expedition targeting the alleged victim's family. Judge Morrison's 20-year career on the federal bench had provided her with extensive experience in cases where wealthy and politically connected families attempted to use federal court systems for purposes that had little relationship to legitimate law enforcement objectives. Her reputation for protecting judicial independence from political pressure had made her exactly the kind of judge that the Whitmore family would have preferred to avoid. Mr. Thornton, the defense has provided substantial documentation suggesting that these charges may be part of a pattern of systematic abuse of federal legal processes by the Whitmore family. Judge Morrison replied, while reviewing the evidence, that Attorney Harrison had submitted. Before proceeding with prosecution, this court requires thorough investigation of whether these charges represent legitimate law enforcement concerns or manipulation of federal authority for private gain. Attorney Harrison's opening presentation to the court would establish the foundation for a defense that would expose not only the illegitimate nature of the charges against Margaret, but also the broader criminal enterprise that the Whitmore family had operated under protection of wealth and political connections. Your Honor, Mrs. Margaret Sullivan stands before this court not as a kidnapper, but as a victim of systematic intimidation and legal harassment by one of Chicago's most powerful families. Harrison began with the confident authority of someone who possessed overwhelming evidence to support his claims. The charges against her represent not law enforcement, but the weaponization of federal legal processes to silence a woman whose very existence threatens to expose decades of criminal activity by the Whitmore banking empire. The evidence that Harrison presented over the following hours would fundamentally alter everyone's understanding of the case, including Prosecutor Thornton's comprehension of how his office had been manipulated into pursuing charges that served private interests rather than public justice. Catherine Whitmore Bradley's testimony provided the foundation for exposing her family's methods and motivations. Her status as Harrison Whitmore II's daughter gave her testimony unassailable credibility, while her 8 years of systematic documentation provided specific evidence of criminal activity that federal prosecutors would be obligated to investigate. My father has maintained detailed records of what he calls problem management activities, including the use of federal law enforcement connections to intimidate and silence women who have posed threats to family reputation, Catherine testified, with calm precision that spoke of years of preparation for this moment. The charges against Mrs. Sullivan represent the most aggressive implementation of tactics that my family has used successfully against at least 6 other women over the past 15 years. The documentation that Catherine had assembled included correspondence between Harrison Whitmore II and federal officials, financial records showing payments to private investigators for harassment campaigns, and detailed accounts of systematic violations of banking regulations that had been concealed through political protection and judicial influence. Dr. Blackwood's medical testimony established the pattern of abuse that connected Margaret's case to other Whitmore family victims, demonstrating systematic behavior that clearly violated federal laws prohibiting conspiracy and racketeering activities. I have documented medical evidence involving 3 other women who experienced circumstances virtually identical to Mrs. Sullivan's situation, Dr. Blackwood testified, while presenting medical records that had been obtained through his professional networks. Each case involved pregnancy by Whitmore family members, followed by economic pressure, legal threats, and forced departure from Chicago under circumstances that suggest coordinated intimidation campaigns. James Morrison's business testimony revealed the economic dimension of the Whitmore family's criminal enterprise, documenting systematic violations of federal antitrust and banking regulations that had been used to destroy competitors and silence critics throughout the Midwest region. The Whitmore banking interests have systematically used their financial influence to force competitors into bankruptcy and silence individuals who posed threats to their business or personal interests, Morrison testified while presenting documentation that revealed clear violations of federal commercial law. Mrs. Sullivan's case represents the logical extension of methods that have been used successfully against dozens of business competitors and former employees over the past 2 decades. But the afternoon's most dramatic moment came when Jonathan Whitmore III himself appeared in the courtroom, accompanied by his father's legal team in what would prove to be a catastrophic miscalculation of their ability to control the proceedings. Through wealth and political influence, Jonathan's presence was intended to demonstrate family concern for Elizabeth's welfare while maintaining plausible denial of paternity that could protect the family from legal and financial obligations. However, his appearance provided Attorney Harrison with the opportunity for direct examination that would expose both his relationship to Elizabeth and his family's systematic abuse of legal processes. Mr. Whitmore, you claim concern for the welfare of the child in Mrs. Sullivan's care, Harrison began with the tactical precision of someone who had anticipated this opportunity. Could you please explain to the court the exact nature of your relationship to this child and the legal basis for your family's claims regarding her custody? Jonathan's response revealed both his family's arrogance and their fundamental misunderstanding of federal court procedures that would not be influenced by wealth or political connections. Elizabeth is the child of a former employee who has unlawfully removed her from appropriate care and supervision, Jonathan replied, with the practiced evasion that had served him well in Chicago social circles, but would prove inadequate under federal court examination. My family's interest in her welfare is purely humanitarian, based on our concern for a child whose mother has demonstrated instability and poor judgment. Harrison's follow-up questioning would expose the contradictions and lies that formed the foundation of the charges against Margaret, while also establishing Jonathan's paternity and his family's systematic pattern of abandoning responsibility for their actions. Mr. Whitmore, if your interest in Elizabeth is purely humanitarian, could you explain why your family has spent thousands of dollars on private investigators to track Mrs. Sullivan across multiple states? Harrison continued while presenting documentation of the investigation expenses that Catherine had provided. And could you clarify whether your humanitarian concern extends to providing financial support for the child's care and education? The questioning continued for over an hour, systematically destroying Jonathan's credibility while establishing both his paternity of Elizabeth and his family's pattern of using legal intimidation to avoid responsibility for their actions. By the time Harrison concluded his examination, Jonathan had essentially admitted to everything that his family's charges against Margaret had been designed to conceal. Judge Morrison's assessment of the evidence was swift and decisive, reflecting her understanding that the charges against Margaret represented exactly the kind of abuse of federal authority that threatened the integrity of the court system itself. Based on the evidence presented today, this court finds no legitimate basis for the federal charges against Mrs. Margaret Sullivan, Judge Morrison announced with obvious anger at having her court used for purposes that had nothing to do with law enforcement. Furthermore, the documentation presented by the defense suggests systematic criminal activity by the Whitmore family that requires immediate investigation by federal authorities. The dismissal of charges against Margaret was only the beginning of the Whitmore family's legal problems. Judge Morrison's order directing federal investigation into their activities would lead to criminal charges that would destroy their political influence and financial empire while providing justice for decades of victims who had been silenced through intimidation and legal manipulation. As Margaret walked free from federal court with Elizabeth in her arms and Thomas at her side, she carried not only personal vindication but also the satisfaction of having exposed a criminal enterprise that had operated with impunity for too long. The desperate gamble that had brought her to Cedar Falls had resulted in justice that extended far beyond her individual case to provide protection for future victims and accountability for those who had abused their power. The train journey back to Cedar Falls carried a very different group than the one that had departed for Omaha 3 days earlier. Where there had been uncertainty and fear, there was now vindication and hope. Where there had been a desperate woman fleeing from powerful enemies, there was now a victor who had exposed criminal conspiracy and secured justice not only for herself, but for countless other victims who had suffered in silence. Margaret sat beside Thomas in the passenger car, Elizabeth sleeping peacefully in her arms, while around them the allies who had made their victory possible discussed the broader implications of what they had accomplished. The federal investigation into the Whitmore family's activities would continue for months, but the immediate threat to Margaret and Elizabeth had been eliminated permanently. Attorney Harrison reviewed the legal documents that would formalize Elizabeth's custody arrangements, while also outlining the civil lawsuits that could now be pursued against the Whitmore family for damages related to their systematic harassment and intimidation campaigns. Mrs. Sullivan, the federal court's findings have established legal precedent that will protect you from any future attempts by the Whitmore family to challenge your custody of Elizabeth, Harrison explained, while organizing papers that would be filed in Nebraska state courts. More importantly, the evidence we've presented has created grounds for substantial civil damages that could provide long-term financial security for your family. The prospect of financial compensation was less important to Margaret than the knowledge that Elizabeth would grow up free from the threats and intimidation that had driven them from Chicago. But the practical reality of securing their future required consideration of resources that would allow them to build the kind of life they both deserved. Catherine Whitmore Bradley's decision to remain in Cedar Falls temporarily while federal investigators completed their examination of the evidence she had provided, created an unexpected opportunity for Margaret to understand the full scope of what her case had accomplished. Catherine's 8 years of documentation had revealed systematic criminal activity that extended far beyond individual cases of harassment to encompass banking fraud, political corruption, and conspiracy that would result in federal prosecutions throughout the Whitmore organization. Margaret, you cannot fully comprehend what your courage in fighting back has accomplished, Catherine said during their private conversation as the train approached Cedar Falls. For decades, my family has silenced victims through intimidation and legal manipulation. Your refusal to be silenced has given voice to every woman they've wronged and provided the evidence necessary to ensure they can never abuse their power in this way again. The federal investigation would eventually result in criminal convictions for Harrison Whitmore II, Jonathan Whitmore III, and 6 other family members and associates involved in what prosecutors would characterize as a criminal enterprise that had operated under protection of wealth and political influence for over 20 years. The banking violations alone would result in sentences that would ensure none of them could threaten future victims. Dr. Blackwood's role in coordinating medical evidence from multiple victims had established professional networks that would continue monitoring for similar cases of systematic abuse by powerful families. The precedent established by Margaret's case would make it significantly more difficult for wealthy interests to use federal legal processes for private intimidation purposes. The medical profession has a responsibility to protect vulnerable Patients from systematic abuse, regardless of the wealth or political connections of those who would harm them, Dr. Blackwood explained during their journey home. Margaret's case has demonstrated that medical professionals working together can provide evidence and support that makes resistance to such abuse both possible and successful. James Morrison's business networks had identified additional companies and individuals who had been victims of Whitmore economic intimidation, creating the foundation for coordinated civil litigation that would recover damages while also preventing similar future abuse. The business community's support for challenging monopolistic practices had proven decisive in building the coalition that made Margaret's victory possible. The train's arrival in Cedar Falls was met by what appeared to be the entire population of the community, gathered to welcome home the woman whose courage had exposed corruption that threatened the integrity of federal legal systems throughout the region. The demonstration of support was both personally meaningful to Margaret and politically significant as evidence of grassroots opposition to the abuse of legal authority by wealthy interests. Sheriff Clark's role in protecting Margaret and Elizabeth during the federal proceedings had earned him recognition from federal authorities for his principled resistance to political pressure and his commitment to protecting community members from abuse by powerful outside interests. His careful handling of a difficult situation had demonstrated the importance of local law enforcement independence from political manipulation. Margaret Thomas Elizabeth, Sheriff Clark said during the welcome ceremony at the train station. Your fight against injustice has reminded all of us why we became involved in law enforcement and community service. You've shown that ordinary people with courage and determination can challenge even the most powerful adversaries when they stand together for what's right. The following Saturday brought the wedding ceremony that had been delayed by federal charges, but was now able to proceed without the shadow of legal threats or family separation. Cedar Falls Methodist Church was filled to capacity with community members who had supported Margaret's cause, along with many of the allies from throughout the region who had contributed to her victory. Judge Porter's decision to officiate the ceremony personally demonstrated the legal community's recognition of the broader principles that had been at stake in Margaret's case. His remarks during the service emphasized the importance of protecting family integrity against those who would abuse legal systems for private gain. Thomas and Margaret, your union represents more than the joining of two lives in marriage. Judge Porter declared during the ceremony, your partnership has demonstrated that love, courage, and community support can triumph over wealth, political influence, and systematic intimidation. Your family will stand as an example of what ordinary people can accomplish when they refuse to accept injustice. Elizabeth's presence during the ceremony, sleeping peacefully in Margaret's arms while Thomas spoke his vows, symbolized the successful protection of innocent life from those who would have destroyed her family for their own convenience. The image would become iconic within the community as representation of their collective victory over powerful interests that had threatened their values and independence. The reception that followed provided opportunities for extended celebration and reflection on what they had accomplished together. Senator Caldwell's attendance demonstrated the political significance of their victory, while the presence of business leaders from throughout the region indicated the economic implications of challenging monopolistic practices successfully. Catherine Whitmore Bradley's decision to settle permanently in Cedar Falls, establishing a legal practice specializing in protecting individuals from abuse by powerful interests, created ongoing institutional support for future victims while also providing Margaret with a friendship based on shared experience and mutual respect. The months that followed would bring additional vindication as federal prosecutors secured convictions against the Whitmore family members and associates, while civil litigation recovered substantial damages for victims of their systematic abuse. Margaret's courage in refusing to be silenced had created legal precedents that would protect future victims while also establishing financial security for her own family. Thomas's adaptation to fatherhood exceeded Margaret's most optimistic expectations, as he embraced Elizabeth with the same devotion he showed to Margaret herself. His natural affection for children, combined with his determination to provide the stability and security that Elizabeth had been denied by her biological father, created exactly the kind of family environment that Margaret had hoped for, but never dared to expect. The farm prospered under their joint management, with Margaret's intelligence and domestic skills complementing Thomas's agricultural expertise to create an operation that became a model for other farming families throughout the region. Their success demonstrated that partnerships based on mutual respect and shared values could overcome even the most difficult circumstances. Elizabeth's development in her first year reflected the security and love that surrounded her in Cedar Falls. Her obvious contentment and healthy growth provided daily evidence that Margaret's desperate decision to flee Chicago had resulted in exactly the kind of life she'd hoped to provide for her daughter. The correspondence that had brought Margaret and Thomas together had evolved into a marriage that honored the values of honesty, commitment, and mutual support that both had sought but feared they might never find. Their relationship demonstrated that even arrangements that began under difficult circumstances could develop into genuine partnership when both people committed themselves to building something lasting together. As 1896 dawned, the Mitchell family faced the future with confidence that had been earned through surviving challenges that would have destroyed less determined people. Margaret's courage, Thomas's loyalty, Elizabeth's innocent trust, and their community's support had created something beautiful from circumstances that had begun in desperation and deception. The mail-order bride who had arrived in Cedar Falls, carrying secrets that threatened to destroy everything she hoped to build, had become the foundation of a family that stood as testimony to the power of truth, courage, and love to overcome even the most formidable adversaries. Their story would inspire other victims of powerful interests to resist intimidation, while also demonstrating that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary victories when they refused to accept injustice as inevitable. Years later, when Elizabeth had grown into a young woman who inherited both her mother's intelligence and her adoptive father's integrity, she would look back on the events that had brought her family together as evidence that even the darkest circumstances could lead to outcomes more wonderful than anyone had dared to hope possible. 5 years had passed since Margaret Sullivan Mitchell first stepped off the westbound train in Cedar Falls, carrying Elizabeth and a heart full of secrets that had seemed impossible to reveal. As she stood in the doorway of her farmhouse kitchen on a crisp September morning in 1900, watching her daughter chase butterflies through the garden while Thomas prepared for another day's harvest, Margaret reflected on the extraordinary journey that had transformed her from a desperate fugitive into the cornerstone of a family that had become legendary throughout Nebraska. Elizabeth, now approaching her 6th birthday, bore no resemblance to the frightened infant who had fled Chicago. In her mother's arms, the confident, intelligent child who raced through the farm with unbounded energy showed clear evidence of the security and love that had surrounded her entire conscious life. Her vocabulary impressed visitors. Her mechanical aptitude amazed Thomas, and her fierce loyalty to family demonstrated that some qualities transcended blood relationships to emerge from environment and choice. "Mama, Papa says the new threshing machine works better than anything the neighbors have ever seen," Elizabeth announced breathlessly as she burst through the kitchen door, her dress grass-stained and her face glowing with excitement. "He says I can help operate it when I'm older, if I study mathematics and engineering like you've been teaching me." The child's enthusiasm for learning and mechanical innovation represented exactly the kind of future that Margaret had dreamed of providing, but had never dared to believe possible during those dark months in Chicago. Elizabeth's opportunities would be limited only by her own capabilities and ambitions, not by the circumstances of her birth or the social prejudices that had once threatened to define her entire life. Thomas's approach through the garden carried news that would demonstrate how completely their victory over the Whitmore family had transformed not only their personal circumstances, but also the broader political and legal landscape throughout the Midwest region. "Margaret, I've just received word from Senator Caldwell's office about the final resolution of the federal prosecutions," Thomas announced with obvious satisfaction as he joined them in the kitchen. "Harrison Whitmore II received a 20-year sentence for banking fraud and conspiracy, while Jonathan was sentenced to 15 years for his role in the intimidation campaigns. The family's banking empire has been completely dismantled, and their political influence has been permanently destroyed." The news represented the culmination of legal proceedings that had continued for years following Margaret's initial victory in federal court. The systematic investigation that had begun with her case had uncovered criminal activity that exceeded even Catherine Whitmore Bradley's extensive documentation, revealing corruption that had affected hundreds of victims across multiple states. More significantly, the Whitmore prosecutions had established legal precedents that made it virtually impossible for wealthy families to abuse federal law enforcement for private intimidation purposes. The reforms that emerged from their case had been adopted nationwide, providing protection for future victims while also ensuring accountability for those who attempted to weaponize legal systems for personal gain. Dr. Blackwood's arrival with the Morning Mail brought additional news that would demonstrate the lasting institutional changes that had resulted from their collective resistance to systematic abuse by powerful interests. "Margaret, Thomas, I've received correspondence from medical colleagues throughout the region reporting that our victim advocacy networks have prevented at least 12 additional cases similar to yours over the past 3 years," Dr. Blackwood announced with obvious pride in their accomplishment. "The protocols we developed for documenting and challenging systematic abuse have been adopted by medical associations in 8 states." The medical profession's response to Margaret's case had created permanent institutional changes that would protect vulnerable patients from intimidation and harassment by powerful interests. The networks that had been established to support her case had evolved into ongoing advocacy systems that monitored for similar abuse while providing resources for resistance and legal challenge. James Morrison's business success following their victory over the Whitmore family demonstrated the economic benefits that could emerge from challenging monopolistic practices successfully. His grain elevator operations had expanded throughout the region, providing farmers with competitive alternatives to transportation and storage systems that had previously been controlled by interests aligned with the Whitmore banking empire. The regional business climate has been transformed by our success in challenging the Whitmore monopoly, Morrison reported during his weekly visit to review market conditions and coordinate shipping arrangements. Independent farmers and small businesses now have access to fair pricing and competitive services that were impossible when the Whitmore family controlled transportation and banking throughout the region. The economic implications of their victory extended far beyond individual business success to encompass broader principles of fair competition and market access that had been systematically violated by the Whitmore family's predatory practices. The legal precedents established through Margaret's case had provided framework for challenging similar monopolistic behavior in other industries and regions. Catherine Whitmore Bradley's legal practice had grown to become one of the most respected advocacy organizations in the Midwest, specializing in protecting individuals and families from abuse by powerful interests. Her office in Cedar Falls had become a destination for victims from throughout the region who needed professional representation in challenging intimidation and harassment by wealthy adversaries. Margaret, your courage in refusing to be silenced has created ripple effects that continue to expand year after year, Catherine explained during their monthly dinner together. My practice now handles cases involving political corruption, business, intimidation, and family abuse of legal systems that would have been impossible to challenge successfully before your case established the necessary precedents. The friendship that had developed between Margaret and Catherine represented one of the most personally meaningful outcomes of their shared struggle against the Whitmore family's abuse. Their bond had been forged through mutual recognition of the courage required to challenge powerful adversaries, and it had deepened through their continued commitment to protecting other victims from similar abuse. The Cedar Falls community had prospered in ways that demonstrated the broader benefits of successful resistance to external intimidation and control. The publicity surrounding Margaret's case had attracted new residents and businesses seeking communities that demonstrated independence from powerful outside interests, while also establishing Cedar Falls as a regional center for advocacy and legal reform. Judge Porter's role in supporting Margaret's case had enhanced his reputation throughout the federal court system, leading to his appointment to the circuit court, where he continued advocating for judicial independence and protection of individual rights against abuse by wealthy and politically connected interests. Thomas, Margaret, your family's victory has reminded the entire legal profession of our fundamental obligation to protect ordinary citizens from systematic abuse by those who would corrupt our institutions for private gain, Judge Porter observed during Elizabeth's 6th birthday celebration. The precedents established through your case will protect future generations from the kind of intimidation that once seemed impossible to challenge successfully. Sheriff Clark's principled handling of the federal warrant and his protection of Margaret and Elizabeth during the crisis had earned him recognition throughout law enforcement circles as an example of professional integrity under political pressure. His methods had been studied and adopted by sheriff's departments throughout the region, seeking to maintain independence from wealthy interests attempting to manipulate local law enforcement. The anniversary of Margaret's arrival in Cedar Falls had become an annual community celebration that honored not only her personal victory, but also the broader principles of justice, courage, and community solidarity that her case had demonstrated. The festival attracted visitors from throughout the region who came to hear the story of how one woman's refusal to be silenced had exposed corruption and created lasting institutional reforms. Elizabeth's role in these celebrations provided her with deep understanding of her family's history, while also inspiring her own commitment to justice and advocacy that would shape her future career choices. Her childhood had been enriched by stories of courage and resistance that would inform her entire approach to life's challenges and opportunities. The correspondence networks that had originally brought Margaret and Thomas together had evolved into systematic communication systems that connected advocacy organizations throughout the Midwest. sharing information about potential abuse cases while coordinating resources for legal and political resistance. Thomas's agricultural innovations, developed through his partnership with Margaret's intelligence and business acumen, had made their farm a model of sustainable prosperity that other farming families throughout the region sought to emulate. Their success demonstrated that partnerships based on mutual respect and shared values could achieve results that exceeded individual capabilities. As the harvest of 1900 concluded with record yields that would provide financial security for years to come, the Mitchell family gathered in their front parlor for their weekly reading time, a tradition that had begun during Margaret's first week in Cedar Falls and had continued throughout their years together. Elizabeth's choice of reading material reflected both her inherited intelligence and her environmental advantages, as she worked through advanced mathematics texts while also studying literature that challenged her understanding of justice, courage, and social responsibility. "Mama, when I grow up, I want to be a lawyer like Miss Catherine, so I can help other families who face the same kinds of problems we did," Elizabeth announced with the kind of determined idealism that Margaret recognized as evidence of her own influence combined with Thomas's fundamental decency. The child's ambition represented exactly the kind of future that Margaret had hoped to provide through her desperate flight from Chicago and her marriage to a stranger whose character had exceeded her most optimistic expectations. Elizabeth would grow up with opportunities limited only by her own capabilities and choices, free from the threats and intimidation that had once seemed impossible to escape. Margaret's response to her daughter's declaration carried all the wisdom that had been earned through years of struggle against overwhelming odds, combined with the deep satisfaction of knowing that their victory had created possibilities for future generations. Elizabeth, the most important lesson from our family's story is that ordinary people can achieve extraordinary things when they refuse to accept injustice as inevitable, Margaret said, while holding her daughter close in the evening lamplight. "Your father and I, along with all the friends who helped us, proved that courage and determination can triumph over wealth and political power when people stand together for what's right." The mail-order bride who had arrived in Cedar Falls carrying secrets that threatened to destroy everything she hoped to build had become the foundation of a legacy that would inspire resistance to systematic abuse for generations to come. Her story demonstrated that even the most desperate circumstances could lead to outcomes more wonderful than anyone had dared to hope possible, when courage was combined with community support and unwavering commitment to truth and justice. Caps. Next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.